The first question on ECS 3702 is usually a question that you should capitalize on, and we expect that you get 25 marks on it, because these questions pretty much come the same way all the time, right? All the time, you always get these questions. So since we are preparing for the exam as we move along with our tutorials, I want to hammer on this again. I think I promised on the last session that we're going to do this one in particular. This was an FI concession, so we could just have it on the other assignment, on the written assignment. Who knows, right? But we'll definitely get a question like this. Okay, I'm just gonna prepare a spreadsheet because that's how we're gonna be doing the calculations for this one. But let's just, so what we covered so far was on the comparative advantage and absolute advantage, as well as, of course, in terms of the comparative advantage, we're discussing the law of opportunity cost. So today, much later after we are done with this, we'll be looking at standard theory, the notes that I sent in the class there. So the notes that I sent in our standard theory of trade. So we are going to conclude that one also tonight. So the notes are there. So I'm just going to be cruising through on that one. All right. So there are two countries. So it's usually our assumption, 2 countries, and then we are also assuming 2 commodities. Those 2 commodities. So our countries, Ivory Coast and Kenya. So Ivory Coast can produce 600 tons of cocoa beans per hour and 300 tons of tea per hour, and Kenya can produce 200 cocoa per hour and 500 tons of tea per hour, right? Represent this information on a table. All right, so I'm just gonna do the table here, right? So we've got, okay, I'm just gonna copy this and just paste it on a spreadsheet. I'm just pasting it there, and then we'll just arrange, right? Once we can all see what's going on, we'll just arrange that. So it's, we have Ivory Coast and Kenya, right? Ivory Coast and Kenya. And it's always good if you can handwrite your assignments and your exam. It's always nice if you can handwrite it. I know most of you guys have very good handwriting, a lot better than mine. The reason why I type a lot is because many people complained about my handwriting, like since way back. My teachers used to complain about my handwriting. Everybody, students now complained about my handwriting. So I ended up resorting to typing. But if you have a good handwriting, it's very nice for you to type. Okay, so we have cocoa beans. What's the other one now? And tea. Okay, cocoa beans and tea. Let's just copy that there. Right, I'm hoping this is going to be a quick lesson. I always prefer these classes to not exceed. It's my hope, it's always my hope that they don't exceed an hour. I always love them to be 45 minutes. Anything over 45 minutes, you start losing concentration. I don't want that. All right, this is the spreadsheet. Okay, so now we are going to arrange this, right? We are going to arrange this. So maybe I'm gonna put countries here on the columns. I'm gonna put Kenya and Ivory Coast, and then the products, let's put them like that. Okay. So in general, you can arrange it the best way you like. Right? You can basically arrange it the best way you like. But I think the way they normally put it is quite understandable. The way they normally write it is actually quite understandable. So if it's possible for you to stick to that, it would be nice. It would be very nice if you can do that. Right? But well, this is how we are going to do it. Right, so I'm referring to the question now. So I think this question paper, by the way, I posted it in the group, so you can have access to it there in the group. It's a 2023 paper, the FI concession. All right, so let's have a look and see both countries have the same amount of resources and time. Okay, Ivory Coast can produce 600 tons of cocoa per hour and 300 tons of tea. So I'm just putting that information there, right? Okay, so let me start with Ivory Coast here, since they are the one, it's the one that they, but it really doesn't matter, by the way. It really doesn't matter. But let me just start with this here. So Ivory Coast can produce 600 tons, and then there they can do 300. What about Kenya? Kenya does 200 of cocoa, and let's see what they do of tea. Tea, they are doing 500, right? Now I'm going to ask you to unmute yourselves, right? Please, if you may, right, to help me answer the question. So I think we are done with this, and you can pretty much put in 4 marks there in the back. Indicate the product of absolute advantage and absolute disadvantage for each country and explain how to reach that conclusion, right? So which country here do you think has an absolute advantage in cocoa beans, and which country has an absolute advantage in tea, and which country has an absolute disadvantage? What do you guys think?
Ivory Coast has absolute advantage on cocoa beans, and Kenya has absolute advantage on tea, and Kenya has absolute disadvantage. I'm sorry about that. No, Kenya has absolute disadvantage on cocoa beans. Then Ivory Coast has absolute disadvantage on no cocoa beans. Tea, no, what is going on? All right, tea for Kenya is a disadvantage, absolute disadvantage. Tea.
Right. So now I would need to know how you got about your solutions. So let's start with Ivory Coast. You said, what's the absolute advantage for Ivory Coast?
Yeah, absolute advantage for cocoa for Ivory Coast is cocoa beans, which is 600. And then no. What is this? Yes,
you are
yes.
right. I agree.
Yes, I'm correct.
You are correct.
Yeah.
Now we need the reason, or we give Lumka the chance to talk also to give us the reason. So okay, before you go, you said Ivory Coast has an absolute advantage here, right?
Yes.
An absolute disadvantage where?
On tea.
Yes, true. So which means if it has an advantage there, it must have, okay, it has a disadvantage there.
Yes.
Right.
With Kenya, absolute advantage is on tea, and then disadvantage is on cocoa beans.
Cocoa beans. That's perfect.
Yes.
I agree. So if that's 4 marks, we have 2 marks now. We need the other 2 marks now. So, Lumka, what do you think that would come to that conclusion?
So Lumka is the one that gave the first reason, and then you're saying I should give the reason why Lumka was saying they have a complete advantage, an absolute advantage, and an absolute disadvantage.
Yes, sorry for that mix-up.
It's okay. It's okay. Okay, so
Lumka, I agree with you on that one. So, Kahle, for now, it's your turn.
Okay, so Ivory Coast has an absolute advantage with cocoa beans because if you were to compare it with the amount of, so Ivory Coast has an absolute advantage with cocoa beans, right? In comparison to Kenya, because they can produce 600 tons cocoa beans per hour, and Kenya can only produce 200 cocoa beans or cocoa tons or tons. Oh goodness. Per hour. And then Ivory Coast would then have an absolute disadvantage when it comes to tea in comparison with Kenya, because Ivory Coast can only produce 300 while Kenya can produce 500.
Perfect. I agree. So Mbali just joined us. So Mbali, we are still on the first part of the question. So the ladies here are saying we are just talking about which country has an absolute advantage and which one has an absolute disadvantage. So it seems straightforward so far. We agree that Ivory Coast has an advantage in cocoa beans. The reason being it can produce more per ton
Yes.
than Kenya. And then absolute, then over on this side for tea, Kenya has an absolute advantage because it can basically produce more than Ivory Coast. Maybe, I just don't know how our markers go about this, right? But in general, if we are gonna say from what we have said, okay, it's always wise again to mention why you would say Kenya has an absolute disadvantage. That's the opposite of what you say now. We are looking at it from the other side where we say Kenya has an absolute disadvantage because it's producing much less than Ivory Coast. Then here Ivory Coast is an absolute disadvantage because it's producing much less than Kenya. Right? Though it seems obvious, but it's always good to make the most out of these questions. So just in case our markers are in a bad mood, we are not going to assume that they are in our minds, right? I think sometimes some of the problems that we have usually, students, lecturers, and tutors, we all share the same problem. Sometimes what's in your mind, you don't really express what's in your mind in writing or in speech. You see. For instance, once you know that Ivory Coast has an absolute advantage, it's obvious that Kenya has an absolute disadvantage there, right? But the marker might assume that you don't know that. You see, the marker might assume that you only know half of the solution. You see, half of the part. So I believe when they specifically say they could have phrased this question this way, okay? They could have simply said indicate the product of absolute advantage and explain how you reached your conclusion. So the fact that they say and they put it in bold there, then it means we should not only just talk about the absolute advantage, but let's talk about the disadvantage. So when we explain why there's an absolute advantage in one country, then we should explain why there's an absolute disadvantage in the other country. Then there we have our full mark. So far we have 8, right? So we have 8. So we are still below half. Right now we need to compute the opportunity cost for each product for each country and determine the product of comparative advantage and disadvantage for each country, right? So we are going to do the calculations here. Right, so which one should we start with? So I think you can unmute yourselves. I'm going to be writing down the calculations here, but I'm going to need you guys to direct me. Right, so I'm going to start with per country. So we're going to start off with Ivory Coast. Right, we're going to start off with Ivory Coast, and then per product, which one can we start with? Let's start with cocoa beans, right?
Cocoa beans.
Cocoa beans, all right. Let's put it right there. Okay, so first of all, we need the autarky prices, right? We need the autarky prices. So how do we go about that? Let me underline. Let me remove that in bold and just underline. So we want the price of cocoa beans in terms of tea, right? That's what we basically want. Can I start with this one and then we join in with the rest? Yeah. So in autarky, autarky prices. So remember here in terms of prices, we are not dealing with rands and dollars. We are dealing with, in terms of opportunity cost, we are saying you can produce one product. Suppose you can't produce both at the same time and you need to give up one for the other. Then that's basically opportunity cost. So the price of the commodity is basically what you have to give up for it in terms of the other commodities. So assuming that we only have 2 commodities, then you can give up the other commodity for the other commodities. We only have 2 options here. So 600 cocoa beans is equal to, so which is in Ivory Coast, is equal to 300 of T, right? That's the autarky prices. But now we need this in terms of ones, right? We need this in terms of, we want to know how much 1 ton of cocoa beans is worth in terms of T. That would make sense. So how do we go about that then? Let's divide both sides by 600, right? So if we divide both sides by 600, we'll pretty much end up with something like this, right? 600 divided by 600 would give us 1 there. So 1C is equal to 600 divided by 300. That one now you can punch in the calculator and you see. All right. That's the autarky price of cocoa beans in terms of T, right? So we are done with that. But now we can't draw a conclusion, right? We can't draw a conclusion yet. Now that we know the price of cocoa beans, we still need the price of T in Ivory Coast. So how do we go about that? Then now we are starting with T. 300 T is equal to how many? 600 C, right? So we are looking at this in one country. We want to calculate this in one country, right? So again, we want 1 T there. So let's divide 300 divided by 300, and then there is going to be 600 divided by 300, right? We simply want to find the price of 1 T, 1 ton of T, right? So 300 into 600, that should give you 2, right? So which means the opportunity cost of producing 1C there, or 1 cocoa beans, is 0.5 T, and then the opportunity cost of producing 1 T is 2C. So far, based on this, we can see that which one is expensive here. It seems producing T is expensive because we lose 2 of C, while producing cocoa beans is quite cheap because we only lose 0.5. So far, we are simply agreeing that it's a lot cheaper to produce in this country. It seems like it's a lot cheaper for them to produce cocoa beans. But let's come and assess now for Kenya, right? Now you tell me, right, for Kenya, and I would love us to start with, let's start with cocoa beans again. Let's start with cocoa beans again. Somebody, anybody, help me out on this one. So we want the price of cocoa beans here in Kenya.
So I
Right.
will say, I will start with cocoa beans, which is, we are going to say 200 C is equal to 500 T.
All right.
Then to get the price now, we are going to say, we start with cocoa beans. We'll say 200 divide by 200. Let me count. And is equal to, what is it? 500.
100.
Divide by 200 T.
Okay. So what
Then
do you remain?
let me, yes. And then 200 divided by 500, it's 2.5.
2.5.
Yes. And then we go to what is this? And the other one, the T. With T, we say
Right. So let me add T there. I think I forgot to add T as a heading there.
okay.
Right. We're going
Then we say now we're going to T in Kenya. T in Kenya is 500.
all right.
It's 500 T is equal to 200 C.
Okay.
and then we say 500 divide by 500 is equal to 500 divide 200 divide by 500. Yes.
Okay.
And
So this
then
one-
it's 1, yes. And then it's 0, 500 to,
0.4.
yes.
I don't know. I think so.
I'm
Yeah,
not
let's
sure
start.
because I'm not, yes. So it simply means that for Kenya, it's cheaper to, no. Let's start, can we go up a bit to what is this? To Ivory?
Yes,
No, not
yeah.
too much. Yes. So for Ivory, it's cheaper to do cocoa beans, but for Kenya is because you only lose 0.5, or you told us that, and then
Yes.
for Kenya is cheaper to do tea than to do cocoa beans, because you only lose 0.4, whereas for cocoa beans you lose to what is it, 2.5.
0.5. All right. So which means when we're writing it down now, let's ensure that the question is answered. So compute the opportunity cost. So we've finished that part, the calculation, and determine the product of absolute advantage and absolute disadvantage. Sorry, not absolute, comparative advantage, no, comparative disadvantage. So now, which means let's start with Ivory Coast, okay? So we'll then say Ivory Coast has a comparative advantage in the production of, we said what? Of cocoa beans, ne? Let's just say of cocoa, given that the opportunity cost of producing cocoa, oops, my spellings, I hate typing so much. Opportunity cost of producing cocoa is 0.5 T, right? In Ivory Coast, while in Kenya, the opportunity cost, let's just say OC, of producing tea, sort of producing cocoa, is 2.5 T. Kenya, therefore, has a comparative disadvantage since they can produce at a higher opportunity cost. All right. So Ivory Coast is a comparative advantage. Let's just correct that. Ivory Coast is a comparative advantage in the production of cocoa, given that the opportunity cost of producing cocoa is 1.5 T, right? In Ivory Coast, while in Kenya, it's the opportunity cost of producing right, cocoa is 2.5 T. Kenya therefore has a comparative disadvantage since they can produce at a higher opportunity cost. Okay, so what we just said there, we basically just vice versa, right? Now we are starting with Kenya, right? Kenya has a comparative advantage in the production of tea, given that. So how you phrase this is up to you, but I'm typing this so that you realize that I'm trying by all means to mention all the issues that were asked in the question. So the question is, who has, first of all, do the calculations, and then who has a comparative advantage, who has a comparative disadvantage, and why? So we have already stated there, we've answered Ivory Coast has a comparative advantage, Kenya has a comparative disadvantage. We've answered that. Why? Because Ivory Coast produces at a lower opportunity cost, which is 0.5, while Kenya is at a higher opportunity cost, which is 2.5. So when it comes to tea, Kenya is producing at a lower opportunity cost of 0.4, right? While Ivory Coast is doing at a higher opportunity cost, which is 2. All right. Very clear there. Thank you so much. All right. Now let's 6 marks.
Tando, sorry, Tando.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go back a bit to your spreadsheet?
Okay, I'm here.
I think.
I hope you are not correcting me about this one.
No, no, I'm correcting you on this one at T, which is 200 by 500. I think, yeah, let me see, because when I was trying to calculate myself, I think we are supposed to. Oh, actually, right? No, it's fine. It's fine. So it's okay.
Right, everything is fine.
Yeah, it's fine. It's fine. I'm sorry about that. Sure.
No problem. But it's good that people are checking. Please recheck whatever we do here. Ne? All right. Then explain whether. So now this is 5 marks are up for grabs on this one. Explain whether trade is possible between Ivory Coast and Kenya under absolute advantage and under comparative advantage, and explain the pattern of trade on that one. So there are 2 issues now. We go back to our diagram. So our diagram, for starters, is gonna help us, since we already spoke about absolute advantage, our diagram is gonna help us in deducing whether trade is possible. And then again, these calculations and our conclusions here are gonna help us to decide whether trade is possible in terms of comparative advantage. Okay, so anyone again, for absolute advantage, is trade possible in terms of absolute advantage? What do you think? I'm gonna start with should I start with it? Okay, let me start on it. So for absolute advantage, in order for absolute advantage to work, right, in terms of absolute advantage, we're talking about efficiency in the production of commodities, right, in our explanation. So Ivory Coast is more efficient in producing cocoa beans than Kenya, right? And then Kenya is more efficient in producing tea than Ivory Coast, right? So when there is a situation now where one country has an absolute advantage in the production of one commodity and a disadvantage in the production of another commodity, while the other country has an absolute advantage in the production of other commodity and a disadvantage in the production of other commodity, then trade is possible in terms of the theory of comparative advantage. So the answer is yes, trade is possible, because while Ivory Coast is an absolute advantage in the production of cocoa beans, it has an absolute disadvantage in the production of tea. Then while Kenya has an absolute, and then Kenya on the other hand has an absolute advantage in the production of tea and an absolute disadvantage in the production of cocoa beans. So according to the theory of absolute advantage, trade is possible. So Ivory Coast should specialize in the production of the commodity that it has an absolute advantage on, which is cocoa beans, and exchange it for the commodity that Kenya has an absolute advantage in, which is tea, right? So basically, Kenya is gonna produce tea and exchange it for cocoa beans, while Ivory Coast is producing cocoa beans and exchanging it for tea. So what you are looking at in terms of the theory of absolute advantage, one country, like we were saying, one country must have an absolute advantage and an absolute disadvantage of the other commodity. So in those circumstances, then trade is possible. So this is opposed to a situation where a country has an absolute advantage in both commodities. Then in those circumstances, watch out for those circumstances. Trade is not possible, right? And in under what theory? Under the theory of absolute advantage by Adam Smith, trade cannot be possible. So here we are saying it's possible because you are basically wanting to concentrate on what you are good at, and then you trade it for what you are not so good at. You see, that's what's there on that one. So just 2.5 marks for that explanation, right? And then when it comes to the other 2.5 marks now, in terms of the theory of comparative advantage, one country, of course, must have a comparative advantage in one commodity and comparative disadvantage in the other commodity in order for trade to take place. So in this instance, Ivory Coast has a comparative advantage in the production of cocoa, so they should specialize in the production of cocoa and trade it with Kenya, who is specializing in the production of what? Of tea, right? So we've already spoken of the pattern of trade there and whether or not trade is possible. So after you are done with that, then you get your 5 marks, right? So you have basically explained whether trade is possible in terms of absolute advantage and comparative advantage. We've covered that. And then the pattern of trade is the direction, right? In terms of who's going to be producing what and exchanging it with the other country. That's the pattern of trade. All right. Is this clear? Any questions on that one? I'm
Yes,
hoping.
it's clear, but I've got one question. So remember, I think last week you had mentioned that there wouldn't be like a possibility of trade if one country has an absolute advantage in like both commodities. So if that was the case, and then they ask us this question, then how would we answer it?
You basically say trade is not possible under the theory of absolute advantage. Why so? Then you come and explain that in order for trade to occur under absolute advantage, one country must have an absolute advantage in the production of a commodity and an absolute disadvantage in the production of the other commodity. So in this instance, which is the instance that you are referring to, you will then say the countries do not benefit from trade because one country is efficient in the production of both commodities. So there's no need for it to the other country.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Okay, my battery is almost switching off, but I'm gonna connect this one now. All right, so we are back onto these ones now. Use the table you created in 1A above to answer the following questions. How much does Ivory Coast gain in terms of cocoa beans? Right. All right. Sorry about that. I'm here. I'm just connecting this this machine here before it switches off. All right. So now, how much does no, it's fine. I think this one will complete it next time about how much does Ivory Coast gain in terms of cocoa beans, explain how much does Kenya gain in terms of tea and the likes. So we did this one, but a different question on our last discussion. So I think on the next one, we are going to start off from there together with what I want us to peruse through now in the last 5 minutes. I want us to be done by 8. All right. So these are the notes that you have there. So these notes are basically adopted from basically adopted from the textbook, right? Simplified version of what you get there in the textbook. But it's on the standard theory of trade. So after this, we'll be looking at the HO theory. So which means I'm gonna give you guys a graph. I think I'm gonna let you know what page it is. A graph that I would love you guys to draw, right? Which they normally bring up in the exam, in the assignments. So I'm gonna give you an assignment or a homework to draw that graph, and then send it through to me, and then we can assess and discuss. Now, a discussion, I just want to see if the graph looks like what we are seeing on the textbook, and if there's anything that you can improve in terms of your drawing skills. It's frustrating in an exam to spend 30 minutes trying to draw one graph. So we want to fix that now so that we are cruising through the exams and the assignments. All right, so in terms of what we are dealing with now, in terms of this, basically still picks up from, now we are picking it up actually from either absolute advantage or comparative advantage. Now we are looking at this in terms of a graphical presentation of this. But this particular version of what we are dealing with now deals with a situation where they are increasing costs, right? So increasing costs basically give birth to a PPF curve, or a product possibility frontier the way we know it, right? Or a PPC the way we know it. So I'm just gonna peruse that for you. So this is what it is. So ideally, if it's constant costs, which I didn't look at together with you, it's basically just a straight line like this. It indicates constant costs. But once it's increasing costs, then you are basically gonna be looking at something that's curved like this, right? It basically indicates increasing costs. What does it mean when we talk of increasing costs? We are basically saying the more you are exchanging from one commodity to another, so assuming that it's product Y to product X, right? Or in this instance, since we are moving in that direction, you are exchanging. Remember, the PPF deals with production, right? So we are looking at shifting your production from X to Y, right? So in other words, you are diverting some of your resources from X to Y. So remember, when you are doing the PPF first level and second level, you are saying it basically gives you a boundary of what a country can produce, right? And then it basically assumes two commodities. So remember, we said in part one, you're saying if, for instance, there's an improvement in technology that affects both commodities, this is gonna bow out. It's gonna increase in that way. Maybe if there's population growth, for some reason, if you can manufacture more of Y and X, this is gonna increase that way, right? But if you are increasing your technology, say in the production of Y, then you expect that there's gonna be an increase on the Y-axis, and your X is gonna stay the same. So just by looking at this here, you can already see that nation 2, right, is more efficient in the production of Y, right, than X, right? And then nation 1 is more efficient in the production of X than Y. Just looking at the shape, right? Just by looking at the shape of the PPF curve, right? It basically means that the nation has a capacity to produce more of X than of Y. So which means if that's the case, then they must be more efficient in that. So dealing with this in terms of the labor theory of value, you are basically saying the labor in nation 1 is more suited in the production of X than in the production of Y. Hence, they can produce more of that. The labor in nation 2 is more suited in the production of Y than in X. So this is just in terms of labor. But later we are going to be assuming now capital and labor, right? I think which we also spoke about in the first assignment briefly. So we are going to be looking at that again. Maybe just to explain it in terms of the slopes that we are seeing here so that we don't struggle in future. In this textbook and in our module, we usually assume nation 2 to be capital abundant, right? We usually assume nation 2 to be capital abundant. So we're also talking about this. Check out on the video for the assignment. We're tackling some of those terms there. So if we are saying it's capital abundant, we are basically saying they've got more capital than labor, right? They've got more capital than labor. So in other words, the ratio of capital to labor is quite high in nation 2. So if that's the case, and then Y needs more capital in its production than labor, and then your PPF is gonna pretty much look like this, because nation 2 has a lot of capital, so you expect that with all that capital, they should produce more of Y than X, seeing that they've got less of labor, which is required in the production of X. When it comes to nation 1, we normally assume that nation 1 is labor abundant, and then commodity X requires a lot of labor in its production, right? Hence, that's why you see the shape of the PPF is more tilted towards, it's more inclined to the X-axis there. That's what that means there, right? So, and then these here are community indifference curves. So community indifference curves, basically, what is an indifference curve? An indifference curve will basically show you your level of satisfaction, right? Basically measures your level of satisfaction between these two commodities. So the higher, the better, right? And then maybe just also do read on what the marginal rate of transformation is, this one here, right? And then juxtapose it again with the marginal rate of substitution. So you just go through this here. It's very simple, right? It's very simple. It's got to do with the gradient of those lines, right? When we talk of equilibrium in isolation now, if a country is in equilibrium, demand and supply coincide, right? So because here we are not drawing a demand and a supply curve, you know that supply is linked with your production. So this is your production curve here.
Sorry, Tando. Hi, Tando.
PPF, right?
Hi, Tando.
Yes.
Hey, I don't know whether I'm slowing down other students.
No, you are not. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
You know, when it comes to graph, I get very, very sensitive because I've got a challenge, né? So I didn't get to, like on the previous one, before this one that is on this slide. I didn't get to when you were talking about satisfaction.
This one.
This one, I really didn't get to. So now you are jumping to another one. Okay, can you please elaborate more? The first one, I think I understood you, but also I wanted to have a question on it, but let me rather ask questions when you're about to close.
Or when we're about to close, okay, that's fine.
Yeah.
A community
explain this one I don't understand at all.
All right, an indifference curve. First of all, we need to understand what an indifference curve means. Indifference curve basically shows the various combination of two commodities that yield equal satisfaction. So which means you are basically talking about, this is more of the opposite of what happens here, right? So this is what you can produce on this one. Okay? This is basically what you can produce, the boundary of what you can produce. Now, when we talk of indifference curves, we talk of what you can consume or what you desire to consume. And in terms of what you desire to consume, we want you to be satisfied, right? We want you to be satisfied in your consumption. Let me highlight that one. Satisfaction is important. So what indifference curve number one here, for instance, shows us is the combination of your good X and Y. So for instance, you'll be taking that part of Y, right, and then that part of X, because we are assuming, for instance, that in your consumption, you are not just going to be consuming one commodity. Let's just say, in our assumption, we are consuming two commodities as a country. So in terms of community indifference curves now, if it's community, then it's for everyone. It's not just you alone. We are saying people in general want to consume two commodities, right? But there are different combinations of that consumption, right? There are different combinations of that consumption. So which means in terms of all these ones that you see now, the indifference curves, if they are a lot, we refer to them as an indifference map, right? Where you have a lot of indifference curves going up, right up until I don't know where. It basically represents that our wants are unlimited. We basically want to consume more and more and more. So if an indifference curve, like if you look at an indifference curve like number 3, it basically talks of more satisfaction than number 1 because it's higher than number 1, right? So you basically want to consume on 3, right? But there are certain circumstances that force you to be consuming on either 1 or number 2, which we are going to be looking at there right below. So this basically speaks of your demand of commodity Y and commodity X. This is what it looks like. So it's a situation where now, in order for you to consume, where we talk of the marginal rate of substitution, sometimes you need to sacrifice Y in order to get X, right? You can't have all of Y and all of X at the same time. So you always need to be sacrificing Y and X. So which means as you are moving down the indifference curve there, you are consuming more of X. So it means if you are consuming more of X, because you are moving down, it means you are consuming less of Y. It's always the case like that. Then sometimes if you're going to be moving up like this, then you are consuming less of X and more of Y. That's the sacrifice, which is referred to as the marginal rate of substitution, which is more of what we're talking of opportunity cost, where you need to give up certain elements or certain units of Y in order for you to get more of X. So it's basically going to be represented as an indifference curve like this. So the easy way for you to think of an indifference curve is to consider it as an illustration of your demand of commodity Y and commodity X. And then this one here, your PPF, think of it as your production, your total production of commodity Y and commodity X. So when we talk of equilibrium now, where your demand and your supply meet, that's where you have your equilibrium. So remember, we said in terms of indifference curves, it's really a map. So you can have an indifference curve that's there, that's there, that's there. But because it's above what this country can produce, then it's all just a dream. It's all just a dream. You can't consume at that level. So where these two coincide now, where they touch each other, that's the highest point, right? Where satisfaction is maximized, because we know that on this point here, satisfaction is maximized, right? Because we're talking about this being a combination where a consumer is satisfied. And then in terms of production, the PPF, if you remember, that you are efficient if you are producing on this line, right? On this line. So this is the highest possible production level that a country can reach. So where the highest possible level of production and the highest possible level of satisfaction meet, you basically get your equilibrium there, which is where those two meet up. So this represents your demand, and then this one here represents your supply in terms of production. What the maximum that nation one can supply, then we match that against the highest equilibrium, against the highest indifference curve, then we get that. So suppose, for instance, the population grows nation one, and then we are able to produce more. This graph is basically gonna be somewhere there, up there. So which means as a community we would have moved up to indifference curve number what? Indifference curve number 2 or number 3 in there. That's basically what it is then. All right, I don't know if we have any questions before we give that one for next week. I think Lumka could have had load shedding because I got load shedding here. Because I saw she was kicked out.
Yeah,
right. Any questions?
I'm back, Tando.
Is it load shedding?
Yeah, it's load shedding, and I'm not used to load shedding because where I'm staying, there's no load shedding. So I'm working somewhere else within the country.
Oh.
Yeah, but I'm fine now. They've got it back up, but it took forever to connect with the Wi-Fi.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right, so I was just saying, I think in your absence there, I was just saying what is in difference. Okay, or let me just stop the recording since it's part of the recording, and then I explain outside the recording.